I'm Jane, and I have a story about my father. My father lived on the farm in Iowa and Minnesota, which is where he grew up. I live in Colorado. He lived in Sioux City, Iowa for his last years. On his 90th birthday, I was in Ireland, and I felt so bad about missing his birthday that when I got home, I called him and I said, Dad, I promise I will be at every birthday from now on. Well, little did I know that that would be 16 more years. The fact that he lived a long life and still had all of his mental faculties was a blessing, not only for him, but for all of us. And at 105, he was still, for instance, beating me at cards. And honestly, I was amazed at how much he could still really discuss, and he would have his long-term memory. It was very much intact. He had stories about growing up on the farm, and he shared a lot of them, and we loved hearing his stories. Along about his 100th birthday or so, I had my brother sitting nearby, and I asked Dad point blank, I said, Dad, what do you think happens after you die? And he said, nothing. And I kind of gulped and I went, well, Dad, I don't quite believe that. I said, I have been doing a lot of reading about near-death experiences and about what does happen after I die or after we die, and what a lot of people think really does happen. And I'd love to share some of those with you. And he kind of went like this, and I thought, okay, well, that's enough. So I stopped. So when I would leave him and go back here to Colorado, I would always say goodbye, and I would say, I'd love it if you'd come and visit me, because I really didn't know after he was 100. I didn't know how much longer he would be with us. Along about the last 3 or 4 years, which I didn't know at the time were his last 3 or 4 years, I kept reminding him every time I'd leave, I'd say something like, love you, Dad, and don't forget you're going to come and visit me. And why don't you come and visit with my brother Gary? And he had no idea what I was talking about. And so one day I told him the story. I said, Gary came and visited me. Gary was my older brother, and he died. He passed away in 2009. And along about a year or so after he passed, one morning I woke up and my bureau drawer, my bottom drawer, which I never open because it's got old stuff in it, was wide open. And it was such that if I walked around my bed, I had to go by that drawer. And I went, what's this drawer doing open? And I said, Gary, is that you? And suddenly in my mind's eye, I could see him. And he was standing there with his arms crossed, which often happened, and with this smirk on his face. And that often happened too. And he was standing there just kind of smirking at me. And I laughed and I talked to him for a little bit, and then he went away. But I thought, this was real. I really felt his presence. So I shared that with Dad. Now, Dad had been old when my brother passed away, and he felt like it was very unfair that his son died before he did. He had a real thing about that. And he had some guilt because he had not gone to all of my brother's baseball games and things like that. And he felt bad about that. So I tried to comfort him in the sense that, we do the best we can, even though you had to work all those days and care for your family. That's the way life is. Anyway, I sensed that he was beginning to listen to me, especially when I told him about my brother visiting. And in December of 2022, early December, I went to visit him, and he was unresponsive. And my younger brother and I would always go visit. And we found out that the assisted living place had put him on morphine because he was in pain. And we asked them to take him off of the morphine while I was there so he could actually communicate with me. So I was only there for 2 days. And the second day that I was there, he was much clearer and could actually talk, although he couldn't get out of bed. And the hospice person was there and telling us that Dad had begun his transition. By this time, he was 106 and a half. And the hospice person said, "We don't know how long this will be. We don't know if it will be days or weeks. So we would recommend that you go home and then come back if you need to." Well, I felt bad, but my brother had it all taken care of. And so I trusted his judgment, and I went home. And about a week and a half or so later, he called and he said, "Dad is gone." Now, that time before I left, I said, "Dad, I love you. And don't forget, you're going to come and visit me, okay, Dad?" Now he's lying in bed and he's barely able to talk, and he says, "Okay, honey." He always called me honey. And I mean, for, the past few years, he would say, "Okay, honey," like, I'll just say okay. But this time, I really think he believed me. I think there was a change in attitude from that day that he said nothing to, "Okay, honey." And I was glad of that. I had tried to plant a seed, but I didn't know if it would grow, and it did. Later in December, I went back for a service. We had a nice service for him. I came home. I can't remember now, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3 after I had returned home. I was sleeping soundly, and you know how you often have dreams at the very last moment in the morning before you wake up? Well, I had this dream, and here's my dream. I was walking my dog, and as I walked down the street, I went, "That's Dad's car." And Dad's car was a yellow Plymouth, an old yellow Plymouth that he loved. And he was driving slowly, and he was driving slowly up the street in front of me, and I recognized him right away. And I stepped out in the street and yelled, "Dad, Dad, Dad," trying to get his attention because I had been expecting him to come. And he went right on by. He was young. He had a butch haircut, which he used to have when he was like in his 30s. And I remember him distinctly, how he looked. He was always a very handsome guy. And he was driving by and he looked straight forward. He didn't look at me at all. And I'm out there in the street, yelling at him. And he's paying no attention to me. He just went on. And I looked at the dog and I said, "We have to run." And we turned around and started to run, and I woke up. And immediately I knew I was waking up from the dream, and I immediately felt the connection. And I said, "Oh, Dad, you remembered." And he said, "I could only manage a drive-by, honey." And I laughed. I burst into I must have laughed for 5 minutes. It was just so heartwarming. And then I cried. And I cried because it was so touching that he remembered, number one, and that he was young and vibrant and still had his great sense of humor. So that's my dream. That's my experience. And honestly, there's so much more than we know. Thanks.